At Christmas dinner, my wife's family gave gifts to everyone, except me. Her mother smiled and said, "Oh dear, we forgot you existed." My wife laughed along with them. I smiled back and said, "It's okay. I didn't forget me." Their smiles faded fast when they opened my gift and realized what it really meant. I knew I was the outsider from the very first time I stepped into my wife's house. No one said it out loud, but the way they looked at me was enough to crush my chest. There was something cold, something toxic like smoke that seeped into every meal, every conversation. I was never fully a part of this family in the 6 years I'd lived with a woman whose relatives never truly wanted me there, and the scariest part was that my wife, the one who was supposed to be my anchor, was the most indifferent of them all. If you think being shunned by your in-laws is the worst thing, wait until I tell you about that last Christmas, the one where everything literally exploded. My name is Evan. I'm 34 and I live in the suburbs of Boston. I work as an accountant for a small tech company, not rich, but enough to live comfortably. I met Olivia when we were both in grad school in Massachusetts, and we married after 2 years of dating. Back then I thought I had found the love of my life, a warm, witty woman who always said she'd stand by me against the world if she had to. What I didn't realize was that the battle would begin in the house she grew up in. Olivia's family is very traditional, proudly extolling their American values. Her mother, Helen, a woman in her 60s with perfectly styled silver blonde hair and piercing eyes, never liked me. I knew it from the very first handshake when she gripped my hand so hard it hurt, and gave me a half smile, as if inspecting a defective product. Olivia's 2 sisters, Candace and Julia, weren't any better. The 3 of them were like a block of ice, united in keeping me at arm's length. At first I thought they just needed time. I tried starting conversations, brought a good bottle of wine to every gathering, even learned to make Helen's exact recipe for pumpkin pie to impress her, but every effort was like throwing stones into a dry well. They didn't care. They didn't want someone like me. And the more I tried, the more they backed away, polite, distant, and utterly closed off. Olivia was great at pretending to be friendly in front of others, but behind closed doors she treated me like a servant, not a husband. She made me wash dishes while she and her sisters sat sipping wine, reminiscing about European trips I'd never heard of. They talked about family memories, inside jokes only they understood, and laughed until they cried while I sat alone at the far end of the table forcing a smile, pretending I wasn't hurting. At first I used to tell Olivia, and she'd just shrug and say, "You're overthinking it, Evan, they just need time." I pleaded, "I don't fit into this family. What am I supposed to do?" She'd say, "Don't let it get to you. My mother's just a little strict, but she's a good person." I heard those same lines for the first 3 years. By the 4th year, I stopped speaking up. They never added me to the family group chat. They planned ski trips to Vermont, birthday parties for Olivia's late father, whom I never met because he passed away long ago, or lunch dates downtown without ever inviting me. I only found out through pictures tagged with Olivia's name on Facebook, with captions like, "Family is everything." Last Christmas, they did a private gift exchange at Helen's house the day before the official celebration. I only found out because I came home early from work that day and saw Candace's and Julia's cars parked outside Helen's place. When I walked in, they were gathered around the Christmas tree unwrapping presents and fell silent when they saw me. Candace gave a weak smile. "Oh, you're home early. We were going to call you later." Helen took a sip of wine, eyes fixed on the TV, and there were only a few small gifts, nothing big, nothing special, while I stood in my rumpled work clothes watching the 3 of them giggle together, holding designer bags, bottles of Italian wine, and cashmere scarves. Olivia was on her phone, not even looking up. But that wasn't the breaking point. The real breaking point came this Christmas when they gave gifts to everyone in the family except me. I didn't know what to expect when I walked into Helen's mansion that afternoon, but it definitely wasn't that kind of blatant humiliation. The house smelled of cinnamon and baked butter, the scent of warm memories to which I'd never belong. The living room sparkled with fairy lights, the Christmas tree stood taller than anyone, decorated perfectly, as if plucked from better homes and gardens. Candace was laughing loudly at one of Julia's not-so-funny stories while Helen stood in the open kitchen still wearing her cooking gloves but already reapplying her wine-colored lipstick. Olivia was pouring white wine for her mother, looking annoyingly carefree. She didn't even notice I was standing behind her for almost a full minute, completely ignored. When dinner started, everyone gathered around a long table covered with a white lace cloth, fine glassware, scented candles, and a turkey Helen dramatically placed in the center like a sacred offering. I sat at the far end, across from Candace and Julia, while Helen sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over her Connecticut palace. Dinner went exactly as I expected, all about them. Candace bragged about her trip to Napa Valley with her new boyfriend, Julia talked about an art exhibit she'd been invited to, and Helen kept praising her daughters while tossing the occasional jab about men who don't know how to make proper pumpkin pie, a not-so-subtle dig aimed right at me. I said nothing. I just smiled and took small sips of wine to keep myself composed. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet this time they'd go easier on me. I was wrong. As dessert was served, Helen clapped her hands 3 times as if about to announce something grand. "Before we eat the pie, I have a little surprise," she said brightly, scanning the table with her eyes. I immediately felt uneasy. Helen pulled out a large gift bag from under her chair and began handing them out one by one. The dark red bag had each person's name on a label. Candace received a leather handbag from a brand I knew cost at least $500. Julia got an all-inclusive 2-day spa voucher at a luxury resort. Olivia was given a rare bottle of wine she had mentioned months ago. I sat still, gripping my wine glass, trying to swallow the icy feeling in my stomach. In the end, there were no bags left. My name wasn't on any of them. Helen turned to me with a fake look of surprise. "Oh dear, Evan, looks like I forgot about you." She laughed. Candace laughed, Julia giggled, and Olivia, my wife, laughed too, that laugh so carefree it couldn't hide their delight. I froze for a moment, feeling as if I were naked in a crowded room with no one hiding their contempt any longer. "It's okay," I said in a strangely calm voice. I gently set my glass down, looking straight into Helen's eyes. "Good thing I didn't forget about me." The room went dead silent, as if my words had shattered a perfect symphony. Helen raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what do you mean by that?" I just smiled. "You'll see." Candace frowned, Julia glanced at Helen, and Olivia stopped laughing. The air turned cold for a few seconds, like a sudden breeze. I said nothing more. I just sat there slowly slicing into my pumpkin pie, savoring every confused stare thrown my way. For the first time in 6 years I didn't feel small. I saw fear in their eyes, even if they didn't yet understand why. And that was only the beginning. I pulled a small box from my briefcase, wrapped in shiny silver paper and tied with a red ribbon like something from a luxury gift shop. I handed it to Helen with both hands, deliberately making sure everyone at the table could see. "For you," I said, my eyes fixed on her proud face that was now darkening. Candace and Julia exchanged glances, and Olivia blinked rapidly, as if she couldn't believe that Evan, the quiet, gentle husband who had always endured, had just fought back like this. Helen looked at the box as if it held a venomous snake. Her hand trembled slightly, though she tried to keep her usual condescending air. "Oh, you didn't have to do that. I thought you knew I never expected anything from you." "I know," I replied softly. "This gift is very special." Curiosity began creeping around the room. Candace raised an eyebrow, Julia sat up straight, Olivia tilted her head toward me, no longer smirking. Helen untied the ribbon and cautiously unwrapped the paper. When she pulled out the thick stack of papers inside, I saw her hand begin to tremble for real. No more pretending. "What is this?" she asked in a strained voice. "My financial reports, from your event planning company, and a few amended tax returns from the past 7 years, I said, pouring myself another measured glass of wine. "Did you know? You underreported at least $240,000 in revenue over the last 3 years, and that's not even counting personal expenses from the company account." The silence crashed down like a sudden storm. The atmosphere changed. No one laughed any longer. The only sounds were the rustle of paper in Helen's hands and her sharp, ragged breathing. Julia was the first to speak. "Mom, what is this? Is this real?" Candace snatched up the documents, skimmed through them, and her eyes widened. "You hid this from us?" Helen didn't answer. She stared at the pages as if she could will them to vanish. Her lips pressed so tightly they went pale, and her other hand clenched the armrest until her knuckles turned white. I took a sip of wine. "I just wanted to make sure you don't forget to report to the IRS, like you forgot me at this dinner." Olivia finally spoke up, her voice low and sharp. "Evan, are you out of your mind? You're spying on my mom." I turned to her, lips curling. "No, I investigated. There's a big difference, and I did it because I have eyes. I see things someone as blind as you can't." Helen slammed her hand on the table and stood abruptly. "You have no idea what you've just done, Evan." "Oh, I know exactly what I've done," I replied steadily, still seated, eyes locked on her. "I also know you've evaded taxes, hidden assets, and falsified financial statements. But you did something worse than that." Candace growled. "What could be worse?" I looked straight at her. "You lied to your own children, hid money while pretending you couldn't help fix the house or support Julia when she was unemployed." Julia looked up at Helen, eyes brimming with tears. "You told me you had nothing to spare, that you had to save for retirement." Candace's face turned red as she slammed her hand on the table. "And meanwhile, you were off to luxury spas, booking first-class flights, and wiring money into a secret account." Helen glared at me as if she wanted to kill me, but I saw something else in her eyes, real fear. Olivia turned to her mother, stammering. "Mom, is this true?" Helen's voice was icy. I pushed a USB drive toward her. "All the evidence is here, bank receipts, statements, internal emails from your accountant." Helen lunged for the drive, but Julia held her back. "No, I want to see it. I want to know how much you've kept from us, and from Dad." The air thickened as Julia scrambled through the pages, her eyes darting back and forth. Helen's eyes then met mine, blazing. "You've destroyed this family." "No," I said calmly. "You started it a long time ago." Helen lunged toward me, but I met her gaze steadily. "If what I just read is true, then I'm speaking to a lawyer. I can't live with someone who takes everything without a second thought." Helen tried to recover. "I just needed a little money to reinvest. The company was struggling." Candace screamed. "It's not about the company, Mom! You used that money for luxury travel, shopping, transferring funds into secret accounts. You lied to all of us." Olivia could no longer hold back. "I trusted you. I trusted you completely." Julia bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, how could you?" Helen's eyes then turned to me, blazing with accusation. "You're behind this. You set me up." I smirked softly. "No one set me up. You've been setting yourself up for years. I just pulled back the curtain." Olivia stuttered. "Evan, are you insane?" I shook my head. "I did it because I have eyes. I see the truth." Helen lunged again, but Olivia raised her hand. "Enough, Mom. If what I just read is true, then I'm speaking to a lawyer." Her voice trembled. "I trusted you with everything," I continued. "I trusted you with our family's future. Now I know you've evaded taxes, hidden assets, and falsified records." Candace slammed the papers onto the table. "Oh my God, you lied to me! You said you had no money when I needed help to fix my home." Julia's voice broke. "You watched us struggle and still pretended you couldn't help." Helen turned away, but her eyes met mine. "I said nothing," I murmured, sitting quietly like a mirror reflecting truth. The dining room door swung open. Richard, Olivia's father, entered wearing a gray sweater and holding a half-finished cup of tea. He stopped as the tension hit him like a snapped wire. "What's going on?" Olivia cried. "Dad, you need to see this." Richard took the file slowly, brow furrowing deeper with every line. "Helen, is this real?" Helen stepped forward, grasping his hand. I did it for the family. I had to keep the company up appearances. I would have told you once things were better. Richard stepped back sharply as if doused in cold water. You took money from my retirement without asking. His face flushed red, eyes bloodshot, voice trembling with barely contained rage. I worked my whole life for that money, Helen. I trusted you to never touch it without consent. Helen tried to protest. I just needed a small amount. Richard could no longer hold himself together. He threw the papers to the floor, then braced himself on the table. I feel betrayed. I can't believe you did this. Olivia's voice snapped. I trusted you. I trusted you completely. Julia cried out. Mom, how could you? Helen then turned to me, eyes blazing. You're behind this. You set me up. I replied softly. No one set me up. You've been setting yourself up for years. Helen lunged once more, but Richard raised his hand to stop her. Enough, Helen. If what I just read is true, then I'm speaking to a lawyer. I cannot live with someone who steals our future without remorse. Helen fell silent, her face ashen. The room, once glowing with Christmas lights, was now filled only with heavy breathing and scattered papers. Candace broke the silence, flipping through a page with widening eyes. Wait, what is this? A transaction from Dad's account? I tilted my head, sipping my wine. Helen stood frozen, gripping the chair as if it might shatter. Julia leaned forward, her fingers trembling over the pages. Mom, you withdrew money from Dad's retirement, clearly from his 401k. Candace's voice stuttered. You said you wouldn't touch a penny. Helen clenched her jaw and tried to stay calm, but the wrinkles around her mouth twitched as if holding back another lie. What did you use Dad's money for? Julia demanded. Helen whispered. I just borrowed it. I was going to return it. I laughed, a cold, sharp laugh. How? With the way you've hidden money and manipulated the books, I doubt you ever planned to pay it back. Candace threw the papers down. Oh my God, you lied to me when I was trying to mortgage my house to buy a condo for the kids. Julia recalled bitterly. I had to borrow from an ex just to pay hospital bills when the baby was sick. You watched us struggle, and yet you pretended to be helpless. Helen's eyes burned as she glared at me. You've destroyed this family. Olivia stuttered. Evan, are you out of your mind? I turned to her, lips curling in quiet determination. No, I simply exposed the truth. All the evidence is here. I slid a USB drive across the table. Look at the bank receipts, the statements, the internal emails from your accountant. Helen lunged for the drive, but Julia restrained her. I want to see it, know exactly how much you've hidden from us, from Dad. The atmosphere grew thick as Julia scrambled through the documents. Helen then fixed her gaze on me, eyes blazing with fury. You've destroyed this family. I answered steadily. No, you started it long ago. Olivia's face turned pale as she blinked rapidly, caught between loyalty and truth. But I no longer waited for her approval. I looked straight at Helen, no longer afraid. The Christmas dinner ended with a very special gift. Candace was the first to break the silence as she quickly skimmed a page, eyes widening at a transaction from Dad's account. What is this? She whispered. Helen stood frozen, her hands still trembling. Julia leaned in, stopping at a bank statement. Mom, you withdrew money directly from Dad's retirement fund. This is clearly from his 401k. Candace's voice quivered. You said you wouldn't touch any of it. Helen clenched her jaw and tried to reply, but the words wouldn't come. What did you use it for? Julia demanded in a shaky tone. Helen's voice dropped to a whisper. I was only borrowing it. I let out a cold laugh. With the way you've hidden money and falsified records, I doubt you ever intended to return it. Candace slammed her hand down. Oh my God, you lied to me when I needed help. Julia's eyes filled with tears as she recalled. You watched us suffer and did nothing to help. Helen's gaze fell to the scattered papers as Richard's face reddened with anger. Richard staggered forward then halted. I can't breathe. he mumbled, clutching his chest. Dad! Julia cried, jumping to her feet. I rushed to him along with Candace while Olivia sprang from her chair, her glass shattering on the floor. Richard? Helen screamed, but her voice was high and theatrical, as if performing in a bad play. Richard bent forward, collapsing like a tree cut at its base. I caught him along with Candace, his body convulsed slightly before going limp. Call an ambulance, I shouted, pulling my phone from my pocket. He's having a heart attack. Julia immediately dialed 911, her voice shaky yet clear. We need an ambulance, please hurry. Helen dropped to the floor, holding her head in her hands. Oh God, Dad, I'm sorry, don't leave me. But no one turned to comfort her. I looked at Helen, my eyes as sharp as blades. She tried to cry, but there were no real tears, only fake sobs and trembling hands as if performing for an invisible audience. Don't touch him, I said coldly as she advanced. Candace interjected firmly. Stay back, Mom, you've done enough. Her words hit Helen like a slap. She froze, then turned to look at Olivia with eyes that had lost their power. The house that once echoed with laughter now held only heavy breathing, the ticking clock, and a man lying motionless on expensive hardwood floors. 10 minutes later, the ambulance arrived with blaring sirens. 2 EMTs rushed in like a storm. Helen scrambled forward to lead them, but one brusquely pushed her aside. We need space, he said. I stepped back as Julia gathered Candace near her. Olivia stood rigid in the middle of the room, her mind clearly shutting down. Helen, dazed, suddenly dropped to her knees, sobbing like a scene from a cheap drama. Please save him, he's my husband, she pleaded. I watched her carefully, every calculated movement, every performative breath, no real tears, no one offering comfort. The only person holding Richard's hand was Candace. One of the EMTs turned to us. He still has a pulse. We're taking him to the nearest hospital. Olivia nodded. I'll go. I placed a hand on her shoulder softly. I'll drive and follow behind. Helen, looking around in disbelief, mumbled, I'll come too. Julia's tone was icy. No one stops you, but don't pretend anymore. We've seen everything. Helen said nothing more. She staggered after the stretcher like a ghost. We walked to the car in silence. Olivia trailed behind me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see that lost look on her face again. Whatever remained between us had burned to ash the moment Richard collapsed and Helen's feigned tears fell. I left the hospital right after the doctor announced Richard was out of critical condition but needed close monitoring due to severe heart damage. Candace and Julia stayed to watch over him, while Helen had vanished after a nurse requested she not disturb his treatment. Olivia sat in the waiting room looking like someone had drained the life from him, but I didn't look back. There was no need. As I stepped into the parking lot, the biting night wind cut across my face like a blade. Instead of feeling cold, I felt weightless. The wedding band on my finger, once a symbol of commitment, now felt like a relic of a life that no longer existed. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at wedding photos on the wall, the souvenirs from our honeymoon in Oregon, the leather chair where Olivia used to sit reading the news. Everything was both familiar and foreign. I took off the ring and placed it in the jewelry box. Then I grabbed a small suitcase with a few clothes, my laptop, wallet, and passport. I didn't need much, I just needed to leave before I started doubting my decision. The next morning, I sent a brief email to the lawyer I'd secretly prepared to contact since last month when I began investigating Helen. The subject line read, "Simply begin divorce proceedings." That afternoon, I received the first message from Olivia since our conversation at the hospital. "Evan, I need to talk, please." I didn't respond. 2 weeks later, Helen was summoned by federal authorities for investigation on tax evasion and corporate fraud. All the documents I'd given to my lawyer had been sent to the IRS and the FB. Not only was there evidence of tax evasion, but also proof that she used fake employee names to withdraw funds from the Small Business Support Program during COVID. The local media picked up the story. Newspapers published photos of Helen leaving court in a gray suit, no makeup, her hair disheveled. There was no trace left of the proud woman who once smirked through Christmas dinner. I didn't feel satisfaction. Shortly after being discharged, Richard filed for divorce immediately. Candace texted that she had seen a lawyer straight from the hospital. Julia cut off all contact with her mother. Helen called, texted, even wrote handwritten letters, but no one replied. Helen lost everything: her family, her reputation, her company. It all collapsed. And Olivia? She sent a flood of emails ranging from angry to pleading. One read, "I didn't know it would go this far. You planned to leave me from the start, didn't you?" I stared at the screen without replying. There was nothing left to explain. If after everything she still thought I was the problem, then there was nothing left to save. One afternoon near the end of the month, Olivia showed up outside my new apartment. I peered at her through the security door. "Evan, please, just 5 minutes," she said, her voice tired and eyes sunken. I opened the door but did not invite her in. "What do you want?" I asked. "I've thought a lot. I was wrong. I should have stood by you," she admitted softly. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "You weren't just wrong, Olivia. You chose your mother. You watched me be humiliated, excluded, turned into a joke, and when I stood up, you said I was destroying the family." She fell silent. "I know you don't trust me anymore, but I'll do anything to make it right." I shook my head. "You don't need to. I'm done waiting for anyone to fix things for me. I've already made my choice." I closed the door gently but firmly. No tears, no anger. Inside the apartment, I sat on the sofa as soft, golden light spread across the wooden floor. For the first time in 6 years, I felt peace, not because Helen had fallen, not because Olivia finally understood, but because I had freed myself. After the last time Olivia came to my door, I didn't hear from her again for weeks. I figured she needed time to accept that the husband she thought would wait forever had left, not with a fight, not with accusations, but with a door that quietly closed without fanfare. 3 weeks later, the first call came. I didn't answer. 4 more calls followed, a voicemail over 2 minutes long, then an email with the subject, "I'm sorry." I sat in a cafe near my apartment, looking at her name on the screen, and felt nothing. No anger, no pain, just silence, like a calm lake after a storm. I reached out and tapped. Block number. That was the moment I knew I had truly let go. Every morning now, I wake at 6 a.m., make a cup of coffee, and open the window to watch sunlight pour across the pristine white walls of my new apartment. I'm renting a small studio in the North End, not far from downtown, but quiet enough that I can hear the leaves fall as winter draws near. I've rebuilt my life on my own terms, neat, peaceful, free of shouting voices or awkward dinners. I shop for groceries alone without feeling empty. I eat dinner in silence without loneliness. I buy myself fresh flowers on Fridays, read on Sundays, and review my personal finances at the start of each month. I don't speak to Olivia. I don't text her mother. And when Helen was officially charged with financial fraud, I didn't celebrate. I simply folded up the newspaper and tossed it aside. Because by then I had understood that true victory isn't when someone else falls. It's when they no longer have power over you. Candace and Julia still keep in touch. They send thank you notes even though they know I don't need them. Once, Julia wrote, "If it weren't for you, our whole family would still be living in denial. I'm sorry we let you suffer so long." I didn't reply, but I smiled. That was enough. A month after Helen's case hit the major newspapers, Olivia called again from an unfamiliar number. I recognized it immediately. This time, I didn't wait for the third ring. I declined the call. 3 days later, she emailed, "I have no excuses left. I've started therapy. I need to fix everything, including myself, not to get you back, but so I can look in the mirror without shame." I read it, clicked archive, and knew I no longer needed an apology. I needed freedom, which I found on my own. One Saturday afternoon, as Boston fell into an early cold rain, I sat inside an old bookstore on Hanover Street sipping coffee and flipping through a novel I'd never had time to read when I was still Olivia's husband. A middle-aged man sitting next to me smiled and said, "That's a good one, you'll like the ending." I nodded, smiling back. I just had an ending of my own. He didn't ask more. I didn't need to explain. I stepped out of the shop as the drizzle continued. The streets were wet and cold, but I felt strangely warm. Freedom, for the first time in my life, wasn't a distant idea. It was a quiet afternoon without shouting, a hot cup of coffee, and a table set for one. I used to think happiness was being loved. Now I understand happiness is learning to love yourself. I don't know what lies ahead, but one thing is sure. I will never return to the man I was in that house. I made my choice. I choose me. Evan's story is a powerful reminder of what it means to wake up after years of being ignored and dismissed by the people closest to you. He didn't seek revenge through anger but through truth, and the strength to walk away when he realized he deserved better. In real life, sometimes we must let go of toxic relationships, even if it means being alone, because loving yourself isn't selfish. It's the journey of reclaiming your worth and peace. What do you think about Evan's decision? Would you have done the same in his place? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to follow for the next emotional family story. Simplified version, plain US English. At Christmas dinner, my wife's family gave gifts to everyone, except me. Her mom even joked, "Oh dear, we forgot you existed." My wife laughed with them, but I quietly replied, "It's okay. I didn't forget about myself." Their smiles vanished once they saw what my gift really meant. I've always felt like the outsider ever since I first came to my wife's home. You never hear it said out loud, but their looks and cold behavior made it clear. I was never really welcome. For 6 years, I lived with a family that never meant to include me, and the saddest part was that my wife, the person I trusted most, never really stood by me. And then, one Christmas, everything exploded. My name is Evan. I'm 34, living in a Boston suburb, and I work as an accountant for a small tech company, comfortable but not wealthy. I met my wife, Olivia, in grad school in Massachusetts. We married after 2 years of dating. Back then, I believed I had found true love, a caring woman who promised to protect me. What I didn't expect was that my struggles would start in the home she grew up in. Olivia's family is very traditional, proud of their American values. Her mom, Helen, always immaculately styled with silver blonde hair and intense eyes, never liked me. I sensed it from our very first handshake when she gripped my hand painfully and gave me a half-smile, like I was a faulty product. Her 2 daughters, Candace and Julia, acted even colder. They stuck together, keeping me at a distance no matter how hard I tried to fit in. I brought wine to gatherings, even learned Helen's pumpkin pie recipe, but nothing worked. They simply didn't want someone like me around. At home, Olivia pretended to be kind in front of others, but behind closed doors, she treated me like I was invisible. While she and her sisters shared laughter over old family stories and expensive trips, I sat silently at the end of the table trying to smile through the hurt. I asked Olivia about it, and she'd just say, "You're overthinking it, Evan. They just need time." But after 3 years, I finally stopped speaking up. I wasn't included on family group chats, invited on trips, or even told about birthday lunches. I found out about events only by seeing photos on Facebook with captions like, "Family is everything." Last Christmas, they held a private gift exchange at Helen's house. I only learned about it because I came home early and saw Candace's and Julia's cars outside. When I arrived, they were unwrapping presents by the Christmas tree and went silent when they saw me. Candace gave a weak smile. "Oh, you're home early. We were going to call you later." Helen barely looked up from the TV. There were a few small gifts, nothing special, while I stood in my work clothes watching them laugh, holding designer bags and fancy wine. Olivia was too busy on her phone to notice me. But the worst part was yet to come. That Christmas, they didn't give me any gift at all. Walking into Helen's mansion that afternoon, I felt the sting of humiliation. The house smelled of cinnamon and butter, decorated like a page from a magazine. but I was never part of those warm memories. Candace laughed at a silly story, Helen reapplied her lipstick in the kitchen, and Olivia poured wine for her mom as if nothing was wrong. When dinner began, everyone sat around a beautifully set table, while I sat far away. The conversation was all about them. Candace bragged about a Napa trip, Julia praised an art exhibit, and Helen even tossed subtle digs about men who couldn't make proper pumpkin pie. I stayed quiet, hoping that would keep the night calm. I was wrong. When dessert came, Helen clapped her hands and announced she had a surprise. She pulled out a red gift bag with everyone's name on it. Candace got a $500 handbag, Julia a luxury spa voucher, and Olivia a rare bottle of wine. I clutched my glass, feeling that icy pit in my stomach as my name was missing. Helen then turned to me with a fake smile. "Oh dear, Evan, looks like I forgot about you." And everyone, including Olivia, ladled. I paused, then said calmly, "Good thing I didn't forget about me." Suddenly, the room fell silent. I slowly cut into my pumpkin pie and savored every confused look. For the first time in 6 years, I saw fear in their eyes. That was just the beginning. I then pulled a small box from my briefcase, wrapped in silver paper with a red ribbon, and handed it to Helen in full view of everyone. "For you," I said. Candace and Julia exchanged shocked glances, and even Olivia blinked, surprised. Helen unwrapped the box carefully. Inside was a thick stack of papers. I explained, "These are your financial reports and amended tax returns from the past 7 years. You underreported at least $240,000 in revenue in the last 3 years, not counting personal expenses." The room went deathly quiet. Julia asked, "Mom, is this real?" Candace picked up the papers, eyes widening. "You hid this from us?" Helen stared at the pages, her hands trembling. I took another sip of wine and said, "I just wanted to remind you to report to the IRS, like you forgot about me tonight." Olivia then snapped, "Evan, you're spying on my mom." I replied, "No, I investigated. I see things you refuse to see." Helen slammed her hand on the table. "You have no idea what you've done, Evan," she said. I continued, "I also know you've hidden assets and falsified records. But worse than that, you lied to your own children by hiding money while pretending you couldn't help when needed." Candace growled, "What could be worse?" I met her gaze. "You misled your children. You claimed you had nothing extra, even though you spent money on luxury travel and secret accounts." Helen's eyes were full of fear now. Olivia stammered, "Evan, are you insane?" I said, "I'm simply exposing the truth." I slid a USB drive across the table. "All the evidence is here: bank receipts, statements, internal emails." Helen lunged for the drive, but Julia stopped her. "I want to see it," she said, scanning the documents. Helen then glared at me. "You've ruined this family." I replied calmly, "No, you started it long ago." Soon the dining room door swung open. Richard, Olivia's father, entered in a gray sweater with a half-finished cup of tea. He sensed the tension and stopped. "What's going on?" Olivia cried. "Dad, you need to see this." Richard took the file slowly, his face reddening with every line. "Helen, is this true?" Helen tried to explain. "I did it for the family. I had to keep the company going." Richard stepped back sharply. "You took money from my retirement without asking," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "I worked my whole life for that money." Helen's protest was lost as she mumbled, "I just needed a little money." Richard threw the papers down, bracing himself on the table. "I feel betrayed," he said. "I can't believe you did this." Olivia then pleaded, "I trusted you completely." Julia cried, "Mom, how could you?" Helen looked at me accusingly. "You're behind this. You set me up." I replied, "No one set me up. You've been lying to everyone for years." Helen lunged again, but Olivia raised her hand. "Enough," she said. "If what I just read is true, I'm calling a lawyer. I can't live with someone who steals our future." Helen fell silent. The room, once full of Christmas lights and laughter, was now filled with heavy breathing and scattered papers. Candace broke the silence, flipping through a page. "What is this? A transaction from Dad's account?" Helen's hand trembled. Julia leaned in. "Mom, you withdrew money from Dad's retirement. This is clearly from his 401k. Candace whispered. "You said you wouldn't touch a penny." Helen tried to stay calm, but her eyes betrayed her. "What did you use it for?" Julia demanded. Helen whispered. "I only borrowed it. I was going to pay it back." I laughed coldly. "With the way you've hidden money and manipulated the books, I doubt you ever planned to repay it." Candace slammed her hand down. "Oh my God, you lied when I needed help." Julia recalled bitterly. "You watched us struggle and did nothing." Helen glared at me as if she wanted to hurt me, but I only said, "I've exposed the truth." Richard stumbled forward, clutching his chest. "I can't breathe," he murmured. "Dad!" cried Julia as I and Candace rushed to help him. Olivia jumped from her seat, the sound of shattering glass echoing in the silence. "Richard?" Helen screamed, but her words sounded fake. Richard collapsed like a tree cut at the base. I caught him with Candace, and soon his body went limp. "Call an ambulance!" I shouted, grabbing my phone. "He's having a heart attack." Olivia immediately dialed 911. Her voice was shaky but clear. "Please hurry." Helen dropped to the floor, sobbing. "Oh God, I'm sorry, Dad, don't leave me." But no one comforted her. I looked at Helen with eyes as sharp as knives. "Don't touch him," I ordered. Candace stepped in firmly. "Stay back, Mom, you've done enough." Her words hit Helen like a slap. She turned to Olivia with empty eyes. The house, once filled with laughter, now held only heavy breathing and the sound of papers rustling. 10 minutes later, the ambulance arrived with blaring sirens. 2 EMTs rushed in. Helen tried to lead them, but one brusquely pushed her aside. "We need space," he said. I stepped back as Julia and Candace gathered close. Olivia stood stiff in the middle of the room as if her mind had shut down. Helen, dazed, dropped to her knees sobbing like a bad drama scene. "Please save him. He's my husband." I watched her every calculated move. No real tears, just fake sobs for an invisible audience. Only Candace held Richard's hand as one EMT told us. "He still has a pulse. We're taking him to the hospital," Olivia said. "I'll go." And I placed my hand on her shoulder. "I'll drive and follow." Helen looked around in disbelief and mumbled, "I'll come too." Julia's tone was cold. "No one stops you, but don't pretend anymore. We've seen everything." Helen said nothing more. She staggered after the stretcher like a ghost. We all walked silently to the car. Olivia trailed behind me, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't bear to see her pain again. Whatever was left between us had burned away the moment Richard collapsed and Helen's fake tears fell. After the doctor announced that Richard was out of critical condition but needed close monitoring for severe heart damage, I left the hospital immediately. Candace and Julia stayed with him, and Helen disappeared after a nurse asked her not to disturb his treatment. Olivia sat in the waiting room looking empty, but I didn't look back. Stepping out into the parking lot, the cold night wind cut across my face like a knife, but instead of feeling cold, I felt free. The wedding band on my finger, once a sign of commitment, now felt like a relic from a past life. At home, I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking at wedding photos, the souvenirs from our Oregon honeymoon, the leather chair where Olivia used to read the news. Everything was familiar yet completely foreign. I removed the ring, placed it in its box, and packed a small suitcase with a few clothes, my laptop, wallet, and passport. I didn't need much. I just needed to leave before I doubted my decision any longer. The next morning, I sent a short email to the lawyer I'd been quietly preparing to contact since last month when I started investigating Helen. The subject line read, "Simply begin divorce proceedings." That afternoon, I received my first message from Olivia since the hospital. "Evan, I need to talk, please." I didn't reply. 2 weeks later, Helen was summoned by federal authorities for investigation on tax evasion and corporate fraud. All the documents I'd given to my lawyer had been sent to the IRS and posted online. There was proof not only of tax evasion, but also that she used fake employee names to siphon money from the Small Business Support Program during COVID. The local media picked up the story. Newspapers showed photos of Helen leaving court in a gray suit, no makeup, her hair a mess, no trace of the proud woman who once smirked through Christmas dinner. I didn't feel relief. Soon after I was discharged, Richard filed for divorce. Candace texted that she had seen a lawyer straight from the hospital. Julia cut off all contact with her mother. Helen called, texted, even wrote handwritten letters, but no one replied. Helen lost everything: her family, her reputation, her company. It all crumbled. And Olivia sent a flood of emails ranging from anger to begging. One read, "I didn't know it would go this far. You planned to leave me from the start, didn't you?" I stared at the screen, not replying. There was nothing left to say. If, after everything, she still blamed me, then nothing could be saved. One afternoon near month's end, Olivia showed up outside my new apartment. I looked at her through the security door. "Evan, please, just 5 minutes," she said, her voice tired and eyes sunken. I opened the door, but didn't invite her in. "What do you want?" I asked. "I've thought a lot. I was wrong. I should have stood by you." I crossed my arms and said, "You weren't just wrong, Olivia. You chose your mother. You watched me be humiliated, excluded, and then claimed I was destroying the family when I stood up." She fell silent. "I know you don't trust me anymore, but I'll do anything to make it right." I shook my head. "I'm done waiting for anyone to fix things. I've made my choice." I closed the door gently but firmly, no tears, no anger. Inside, I sat on the sofa as soft, golden light spread across the wooden floor. For the first time in 6 years, I felt peace, not because Helen fell, not because Olivia finally understood, but because I had freed myself. After that day, I didn't hear from Olivia for weeks. I assumed she needed time to accept that the husband she thought would wait forever had left quietly, without a fight or harsh words. 3 weeks later, I got a call. I didn't answer. 4 more calls followed, a 2-minute voicemail and an email titled, "I'm sorry." I sat in a cafe near my apartment, saw her name on the screen, and felt nothing, no anger, no pain, only silence like a calm lake after a storm. I blocked the number. That was when I knew I had truly let go. Every morning now, I wake at 6 a.m., make coffee, and open the window to let the sunlight spill across the white walls of my new apartment. I'm renting a small studio in the North End, close to downtown but quiet enough to hear the falling leaves in winter. I've rebuilt my life on my own terms, neat, peaceful, and free from yelling or awkward dinners. I shop for groceries alone without feeling lonely, I eat dinner in silence without emptiness, and I buy fresh flowers on Fridays. I read on Sundays and review my finances every month. I don't talk to Olivia anymore. I don't text her mom. And when Helen was officially charged with fraud, I didn't celebrate. I simply folded the newspaper and threw it away. Because I learned that real victory isn't when someone else falls. It's when they no longer have power over you. Candace and Julia still keep in touch. They send thank you notes even though they know I don't need them. Once, Julia wrote, "If it weren't for you, our family would still be in denial. I'm sorry we let you suffer so long." I didn't reply, but I smiled, and that was enough. A month after Helen's case hit the papers, Olivia called from an unknown number. I recognized it immediately and didn't let it ring. 3 days later, she emailed, "I have no excuses left. I've started therapy. I need to fix everything, not to win you back, but so I can look in the mirror without shame." I read it, archived it, and knew I no longer needed an apology. I had found freedom on my own. One Saturday afternoon, as Boston fell into an early, cold rain, I sat in an old bookstore on Hanover Street sipping coffee and reading a novel I'd once had no time for. A middle-aged man next to me smiled and said, "That's a good one, you'll like the ending." I nodded and smiled back. I had my own ending now. No explanation was needed. I left the shop as the drizzle continued. The wet, cold streets couldn't touch the warmth I felt. Freedom wasn't a distant idea, it was an afternoon without shouting, a hot cup of coffee, and a meal for one. I used to think happiness was being loved, now I know it's learning to love yourself. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I will never go back to the man I was in that house. I made my choice, I choose me. Evan's story is a reminder that after years of being ignored and dismissed by those closest to you, sometimes the only way to find truth and freedom is to walk away, even if it means standing alone.